Hello everyone, Horny Alf back for another 40k reaction video. And I will say I've been having a lot of fun with these videos. I say this every video, but this franchise, this world of 40k is fascinating. It's far different than most sci-fi shows or franchises I've seen where they paint more of a happier future. But today we're going to be watching another Weshammer video. I've watched one of his videos so far. So, after I did my first video watching Bricky talk about the factions of Warhammer, I had a lot of people in my comments asking me to watch Bricky's timeline video, and I think I can't remember if I put it in the comments or in my next video. I have seen Bricky's timeline video. That was the video that got me into doing these reaction videos. So I didn't have a reaction to that video. However, to compromise, I found Weshammer has a very similar video. Maybe he'll go into a little bit more detail than Bricky did. Bricky tends to brush along the surface, doesn't hit every detail. We'll see what Weshammer provides for us. But we're going to do he has a timeline explained video, and we're going to go ahead and get that started now.
By the end of this video, you're gonna know everything there is to know about the Warhammer 40k timeline. Sorta, let me explain. But first, if you're unfamiliar with 40k, it's this super dark science fantasy franchise, where humanity is ruled over by the bloodiest regime imaginable and religious dogma, and beset on all sides by voracious aliens, heretics, and literal demons. It's kinda like the exact opposite of Star Trek, where Star Trek's all about peace and love and hope, and 40k is like, nah, fuck that, we tried that. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war.
Yeah, so this is what I was talking about. This is just every possible bad interpretation of what the future could look like wrapped up into one franchise. And it's freaking amazing. Yeah, you do have your protagonists, you have some good characters, but in the end, the entire universe, it just sucks to be a normal person in this world. But, alright, let's continue.
But it's also super intimidating for new people to get into. There's over 400 novels, not to mention 30 years worth of lore. And as somebody who's read over 100 of those novels, most of those events, albeit important.
And speaking of that, I've looked into getting some of the novels. I want to look up the books that have to do with the fall of Cadia, the Ultramarine Primarch returning, and then going on I think it was called the Indomitus Crusade. I want to look up those books, and I may start reading into those sometime in the future.
Don't really contribute to you knowing what's going on in the franchise. So today we're going to take the entirety of the 40k timeline and boil it down to just the basics. Just those critically important time periods that you need to know about in order to understand 40k. Because if I was to try to explain the plot of all of those books in order, we would be here for like 10 hours. So with all that out of the way, let's dive in where the timeline truly begins. 60 million years ago with the War in Heaven.
The War in Heaven and its surrounding events can arguably...
So Bricky talked about this. I've seen other people talk about this. He provided a lot of information, what seemed like a lot of information. I assume Weshammer's going to as well. But what I understand is that's just about all the history they know, because it's happened so long ago. It's very vague on the histories, the recollections, what I hear of the Necrons in their robot forms. Their memories may not be as accurate as they used to be. The elves may not be painting the picture accurately either, but let's see what Weshammer has to say about it.
Be said is where the timeline of 40k begins. To understand this, we need to know about the Necrons and the Old Ones. You see, before the Necrons became the undead metal robots that we know in the 41st millennium, they were a species known as the Necron tier. Most records on this time are unfortunately incredibly fragmentary, and what we do know is mostly derived from ancient Eldar myths and legends, a species who's famous for speaking in 99% metaphors and 1% facts. So you have to take all of it with a little bit of a grain of salt. The Necron tier were a frail and dying people. They lived next to a super radioactive sun that caused cancer to run rampant through their society. They were, however, incredibly tenacious and refused to give up. They sent their people out into space to find new homes and were ultimately successful, populating many new planets. However, the curse of their homeworld would inevitably follow them into the stars, and generation after generation would still be afflicted with terrible radiation sickness. Now, all hope seemed
Okay, anyone in the audience, can you tell me why? If their homeworld was where they received the radiation from whatever star they had, that painted them with these afflictions, if they sent their population out to other planets, then why would future generations growing up on other planets still have those radiation sicknesses or issues? Is it something that once it got into their genetics, it was passed down generation to generation, or was it an outside influence that I am unaware of doing it to them? I just clear that up. Let me know.
lost for the Necron tier, but that all changed when they encountered an incredibly advanced alien
the old
species
ones.
known as the Old Ones. Their technology was absolutely insane, and they seemingly had
So, were the old ones gods, or were they just super advanced species that, from a species like the Necron tier, they seemed like gods, or they treated them like gods, or are they just a hyper advanced species? Let me know.
unlocked the secrets to immortality. Now, the Old One's primary goal was to seed life throughout the galaxy, placing microscopic organisms on barren worlds across the cosmos that would later develop into fully sentient species. And it's even rumored that the Old Ones played a role in the development of our own species. When the
Okay, that's fascinating, because in Bricky's video, he does mention that the old ones, in order to fight the Necrons later on in the War in Heaven, created the elves and the orcs, but I didn't know that they did much further seeding of life than that, and even potentially affecting the human race. If anyone has any more comments on that, drop it in my comments of this video. That would, that's interesting.
Necron tier encountered the Old Ones, they begged them for help, but unfortunately the Old Ones would end up refusing them. Now, they were sympathetic to the Necron tier's plight, but basically told them that their fate was their own, and they were the masters of their own destiny, and that the Old Ones just didn't want to get involved. Now, this infuriated the Necron tier, and they declared war on the Old Ones. And this went about as well as you could expect it to. The Necron tier were nowhere near as capable as the Old Ones, and basically got stomped into the dirt.
Basically, the old ones put them in their place. Bricky put it a different way, in a more humorous way, but yeah, they basically just stomped them back to their worlds, I guess.
Dirt every single time they attacked. Now, this would all change when the Necron discovered a new species known as the Catan, who were basically giant, formless, star-sucking vampires.
Next question. The Catan. Are they actually gods, or are they just another hyper-advanced species? Are they more powerful than the old ones? Say you put a Catan up against an old one one-on-one, who's more powerful? These are just questions I have. I didn't ask the last time last couple videos, but yeah, now that we're on the subject, let me know.
Vampire star gods that were masters of the physical universe. Each and every one was a wielder of absolutely godlike power, and they told the Necron tier that they also had a deep-seated hatred of the Old Ones. And if the two species were able to form some kind of alliance,
is there any explanation why the star gods hated the old ones? I'd be willing to, I want to know.
they would be able to work in tandem and wipe out their ancient enemies. And if this wasn't good enough, the Catan also promised the Necrons the secrets to immortality. Their people would not know another day of suffering. And this sounded too good to be true for the Necron tier, and that's because it kinda was. You see, this immortality would take the form of their physical bodies being burned away, and an engram copy of their consciousness being downloaded into robotic mechanical skeletons. Their new bodies were made out of this miraculous metallic substance known as necrodermis, an incredible living metal that had the ability to repair itself.
Yep, he tricked them, turned them into technically immortal species, but they take away all of what made them their own race. So essentially their race went extinct, and all that's left is their minds in robots that will live forever.
This was a substance that was originally developed by the Necron tier and had been used in most of their starships. Not only was it incredibly durable, but it offered a lot more protection than their flesh bodies, and their warriors could regenerate from any wound that didn't completely obliterate them. This whole process was known as biotransference, and the entire species was subjected to it. Now, this was the day that the Necron tier species died, confined to the halls of extinction, and in their place was simply the Necrons. Now, together the Necrons and the Catan would strike back against the old ones, and their combined might was enough to put them on the same level. Harnessing the Catan's limitless energy, the Necrons were able to make weapons of inconceivable power. The war between the Necrons and the Old Ones was the largest the galaxy had.
So did the Catan provide technology to the Necrons once they converted them to their robot forms? Did they provide them with things and weapons and technology better than what they already had? Let me know in the comments.
Had ever seen. It spanned from the galaxy's core all the way to the galactic rim. Now, during this war, there was a point when the Necrons suddenly realized that they had been tricked by the Catan, and the Catan had used biotransference in order to separate them from their souls, which they then subsequently devoured. Needless to say, the Necrons were pretty pissed, and retaliated by attacking and destroying the individuals they once worshipped as gods, shattering them into thousands of pieces, and binding each of these shards into what were known as Tesseract vaults, and then subsequently used these
And in Bricky's video, he equates them to giant Pokemon.
shards as weapons. It was around this time that the Old Ones created two new races to help fight against the Necrons. These would be the Orcs and the Eldari, one being massive hulking brutes that were the ultimate physical specimens, while the others,
Eldari, were particularly good at killing Necrons, apparently, what I understand. I don't know, Bricky didn't go into any detail on how much effect the Orcs had on the war in heaven and fighting the Necrons, but if you know more about that, please drop it in the comments.
were master psychers, every single one being in tune with the warp and able to bring about enormous ruination by channeling its power with their mind.
So I just want to take a moment to point out that at this point in the timeline, we have a race of vaguely Egyptian ghosts trapped inside robot skeletons fighting against an entire race of psychic alien god frogs who have created a race of space wizards and space orcs in order to fight the undead robots. 40K can get pretty wild sometimes.
Now the devastation that was
that's some pretty crazy stuff right there. And humanity hasn't even stepped foot on the scene yet. That's wild stuff.
brought on by the war in heaven reached not just the Old Ones, the Necrons, the Eldari, and the Orcs, but there were tons of other civilizations that were living peacefully in the galaxy as well. And they all ended up getting caught in the crossfire at one point or another. And this war spanned millions of years, so the amount of untold destruction and lives lost is truly uncountable.
And this is where Bricky talked about all of this death and destruction fed into the warp and turned it into what used to be just a place to something much worse, expanded the Chaos God's control of the warp because of all the fresh souls that were being dumped into it. Yeah, crazy stuff.
And the warp isn't just called the Sea of Souls for nothing. It's where the souls of sentient creatures go when they die. So the amount of angry and terrified souls that were lost in this war started flooding into the warp en masse. And this would have some very particular ramifications, but we'll circle back to that in a second. Now, it was around this time that the Necrons started experimenting with Blackstone, an incredibly bizarre material that has the ability to either channel and amplify the energies of the warp, or nullify it completely. So the Necrons built massive spires made out of Blackstone and placed them on thousands of worlds across the galaxy. Hundreds of thousands of years later, these would be known as the Blackstone pylons. Now, the Necrons are—
Alright, that's interesting. Berkey didn't talk about that in his video. So these Blackstone pylons are used, what, to keep chaos at bay from entering into the real space? I'm just guessing, but let me know. He may go into that.
Original purpose for these isn't really stated, as their major significance to the storyline wouldn't really become apparent until around the time of the Black Crusade, but I'm getting ahead of myself. As creatures solely of the physical universe, with no ability to manipulate the warp themselves, fighting against a race that was all about psychic powers, it's pretty easy to assume that the Blackstone pylons were meant as a defense network, as negatively charging their energy could create a massive nullified area of space-time where psychic powers couldn't be utilized. And this would serve as a powerful defense network against their enemies. So it's at this moment during the War in Heaven when the warp becomes incredibly important to the storyline. Up until this point, the Immaterium or the Sea of Souls had been a rather tranquil place. You see, the warp is a mirror universe.
Yep, that's what Bricky was saying, that it was fairly benign, tranquil place that souls went to, but it wasn't. It was like being. He explained it like being in the ocean. You know, it just is. There are parts of the ocean that are dangerous. There were the chaos gods that existed in the warp, but the warp was not as chaotic as it is in 40K time period. But I assume he's going to go more into that.
A reflection of our own, but it's a realm of emotion rather than tangible substance like that found in the physical universe. Now, there had been sentient species across the galaxy for a pretty long time at this point, and there had certainly been wars and hatred and anger and all of those negative emotions, but they had never existed quite on this scale. A single planet that has a bunch of people that can't really get along and a bunch of negative feelings isn't quite the same thing as a galaxy-spanning war, and the absolute massacre of an inconceivable amount of people across the entire galaxy for a massive period of time caused the warp to become incredibly unstable. The peaceful creatures that lived in the Sea of Souls were twisted into horrifying nightmares, and during the events of the War in Heaven, the warp became the realm of chaos. And if that wasn't bad enough, the psychic allies that the Old Ones had created for
That's a question I have, because the chaos gods lived in the warp. Were they always there, or because I know when the Eldar did what they did, and Slaanesh came to be, were any of the Chaos Gods birthed because of this War in Heaven? Or were they always there, and because of the War in Heaven, it fed them and made them more powerful? Let me know.
for themselves, who were directly acting as conduits for the warp, would end up tearing holes in reality and causing what was known as the Enslaver Plague. Massive amounts of these warp-born monstrosities, known as enslavers, ripped into our universe and spread out across the cosmos, devouring any sentient life they could find. They flooded into the Old Ones' bastions, drawn to them like moths to a flame. The Old Ones in their weakened state were in no position to fight them off, and it is believed that they went extinct. Now, admittedly, everything gets kind of blurry here, and we're not 100%.
I know what he's about to say. I think I know what he's about to say. Blurry, meaning that the 40K universe is, there's a lot of moments in history in the 40K universe that can be very vague, very blurry. They're not set in stone, so things can change. Like they think the Old Ones are dead, but maybe they're not. Something like that.
Sure what exactly happened to them, but after the war had concluded, the Necrons were left in a fractious state. They had taken inconceivable losses, and the Eldari had risen to power and were slowly expanding and taking over the galaxy. If the Necrons had tried to fight them after an all-out war with the Old Ones, they more than certainly would have perished. So the Silent King ordered them to go to sleep within their tomb worlds and set the timer for 60 million years. He believed that by this point the Enslaver Plague would have run its course, and would have dissipated back into the warp. Also, the Eldari surely would have died off by then, and whatever species was left.
So the Enslaver Plague, did they go after the Eldari? They said they went after sentient life. I'm assuming the Eldari dealt with them, or maybe they weren't a threat to the Eldari and died off on, and the enslavers and died off on their own. That's new to me. It wasn't covered in any of the video I've watched.
Over to inherit the galaxy wouldn't be ready for the godlike creations of the Necrons, who would then reclaim what was rightfully theirs. Now, the time between the War in Heaven and the rise of humanity is a time mostly dominated by the Eldar, who were left to inherit the galaxy after the war had concluded. They knew a time of peace like no other, as every other sentient species had no hope of challenging them. So they could pretty much do whatever they wanted. Now, here's the thing about being immortal and having no wars to fight. You got a lot of free time on your hands, so the Eldar got really into the arts and other leisure activities.
This is where things are about to get crazy. Yes, this is where the Eldar turn into depraved society. But let's let him talk about it. Maybe he'll bring in a new twist to it.
Pursuing pleasure instead of violence. Now, this started off normal enough, At first, they pursued music, poetry, sculpture, theater, and pretty much any artistic pursuit you can think of. But over 60 million years, these pursuits of study started getting boring to them, and their desires started to take on a much more hedonistic and depraved form. But we'll circle back to that shortly. Now, millions of years after the War in Heaven had concluded, far from the Eldar Empire, there was a tiny little planet known as Earth, where a new species was coming into its own.
So why is the rise of humanity and the birth of the Emperor so important? Now, 40k is a franchise that focuses on a lot of different characters and factions, but the human perspective is arguably the main one, as most of the novels and stories focus on the humans. In the story,
Yeah, that's the impression I get, is that the crux of the story surrounds the Emperor and humanity. There are individual stories that people have told me in comments in previous videos that, yes, there are some stories that focus on other species, and humanity, although they preach everything against Xenos, humanity does have certain Xeno races that they more or less somewhat tolerate, or from time to time are willing to work with certain factions of these Xeno races. But mainly, I've heard the Eldar and the Tau at times. But yeah, the story focuses on humanity for the most part.
The storyline of humanity in 40k sees them rise to power and then have their empire crumble around them, only to rebuild but be set in a new dark age.
But that happens with almost every race in this setting, has had a rise and a fall, maybe with the exception of the Tau, but unless there's more about that I don't know. But every race has had a rise and a fall, and then they're not where they were at their peak.
Probably the most famous quote that's associated with 40k summarizes this pretty perfectly. Forget the promise of progress and understanding, for in the grimdark future, there is only war. So to understand how we ended up there, we need to know where humanity began.
The timeline of humanity in real life and 40k follow similar events, all the way up to the present, with one big golden difference, and that would be the Emperor of Mankind. Now, the individual that would come to be known as the Emperor was born around the year 8000 BC. You see, there was a group of individuals known as the Shaman, each one of them an immensely powerful psyker, much like the Eldari. And with the exception of the Eldar, psykers were insanely rare at this point in time. It wouldn't be until tens of thousands of years later when psykers started popping up much more regularly in human populations. Back then, it was more of a 1 in 10 million type of situation. So the shamans foresaw a great apocalypse coming, and humanity would need a being of inconceivable power in order to stand against it. So all of the shamans sacrificed themselves to infuse their psychic essence into a single individual. This creation was what they referred to as the New Man, the first in a line of superhumans that represented humanity's eventual evolutionary path.
Okay, that's news to me. Bricky didn't cover that in his video. Granted, his video is a few years old, so maybe this is newer information, but and that's the next question. How new is that information? Because when I learned about the Emperor and about how his backstory was kind of vague, and now I'm hearing there's a backstory that shows how he was created through this video, I actually prefer the vague backstory where no one really knows where he came from. I don't think in stories everything absolutely has to be explained. Sometimes that mystery leaves people craving more, and I don't think there needs to be an explanation. But if that's true, let me know in the comments, or is that just one telling of the story, and then maybe that's not necessarily his origin, but it's just one telling of it. I don't know. Let me know.
The Emperor, who at this time was known as Neo, was born to mortal parents and lived.
That's also new. Neo. Where did that come from? From the same story about his origin? That's interesting.
Lived in a Neolithic tribe. As the boy aged, he became painfully aware that he was unlike any other person on the planet, capable of great and amazing acts of psychic might. He witnessed the barbarism of ancient man firsthand when his uncle killed his father. Calmly and without wrath, the Emperor issued a single thought and stopped his uncle's heart as punishment for his crime. The young boy realized that if humanity was to survive, it would need law and order. Now you see, he was what was known as a perpetual, an immortal being that could never truly die. Neo would then keep himself.
Okay, I've heard of the word perpetual. So does that make him a god. Now, and the way they were explaining it is he's a being fused with warp energy based on that origin that he just talked about. Does that make him a god, or is it more of a demigod type status who doesn't die? Yeah. Let me know in the comments.
Hidden for thousands of years, guiding humanity from the shadows. Now, every now and then, he would step forth and fill in the role of some type of leader figure, a politician, a doctor, a general, or even a messiah.
Oh, that's fascinating. So throughout human history, at pivotal points, he would step up and take the role of certain uh, important person and influence the flow of human history. That's pretty cool. But who did he play as? Did he take up the role as a Caesar, or did he take up the role as Alexander the Great? Who knows? All these epic characters in our history, maybe that was him.
Figure apparently at one point. He would spend this period of time guiding humanity on the path he had envisioned for them, making sure that certain events carried out according to his plans that were tens of thousands of years in the
That's
making.
crazy.
Over the years, the Emperor would gather other perpetuals to his side. This included Erda, a childhood friend of his, and the woman who would eventually become the mother of the Primarchs, and possibly most famously,
Mother of the Primarchs. Okay, that's new for me as well, because in Bricky's video he talks about how, well, he doesn't really give an explanation, he just says that the Emperor, I guess in his explanation, created him through science with his own DNA to create the Primarchs and had them in gestation tubes. But now they're saying there was a mother figure. If you know more information on that, if that's just one telling of a potential story of how the Primarchs came to be, or if it is the canon explanation, let me know.
Malkador the Sigillite, although he technically wouldn't meet him until somewhere between the 20th and 30th millennium. When it comes to early human history, the period between 8000 BC to 15,000 AD is often referred to as the Age of Progress. During this time, powerful nations rose and fell, with the Emperor popping up in disguise every now and then to coax humanity in the direction of his choosing. Now, there's a lot of evidence to support the fact that the Emperor had godlike cognitive abilities, and could foresee the path humanity would need to take step by step to achieve impossible outcomes. Humanity would eventually develop the means of space travel, and would colonize the entirety of the Sol system. Mars would be terraformed, and became a habitable space much like that of Earth.
Fascinating. So yeah, this is what Bricky was talking about. This age when humanity is rising and then going into the next stage that I assume Wes is going to talk about soon is the age of technology, or dark age technology, where humanity, every potential, future of sci-fi that we know of, Star Trek, Star Wars, this was that time period of, worlds are advancing, humanity's getting more powerful, it reaches the top tier of where humanity would be, and then they see a fall.
Well, the asteroid belts would give rise to massive mining operations to provide the young species with everything that it would need to create some of the most advanced pieces of technology the galaxy had ever or would ever see. And this was a good thing too, because at this point, Earth was steadily running out of all of its natural resources. The Age of Progress would officially come to an end when humanity set its sights outside of their star system and sought to colonize distant worlds. And the next era that we're moving into was known as the Dark Age of Technology.
Yep.
So why do I feel like the Dark Age of Technology is so important for you to understand? You see, this was the height of humanity's power, where we lived in a golden age and can do pretty much anything. Most of the really cool equipment that you see in 40K that's used by humanity can trace its origins back to this time. For example, did you know that the Baneblade, one of the largest tanks that the Astra Militarum uses, was originally just a scouting vehicle during the Dark Age of
That's crazy. Yeah, I'd heard other commentary from people who know 40K, is that humanity had some crazy weapons during this time period, like the ability to create black holes or stuff like that. That's crazy.
technology, at least according to its STC. Also, the suits of power armor known as Terminator armor that the Space Marines wear was originally mining equipment during this time. Now that's a little bit of a misnomer. The Emperor created those suits specifically for war, but their underlying technology, all of the protective equipment inside of it, was either used for mining the asteroid belts or as a protective system for people who had to work on plasma generators. And one of the most important things to understand about what 40K even is its humans' continued existence after the collapse of their utopia.
So the Dark Age of technology lasted from the 15th to the 25th millennia. Now this was an
Yeah, that's what I heard. 15th to 25th. 25th is when humanity collapsed, and he's probably going to get into it. But there was an AI rebellion, in combination with the birth of Slaanesh and the warp being unusable. But that's fascinating that you see technology like the power armor suits, where they originated. They were used for mining or peaceful uses, and then repurposed by the Emperor for armor for his Space Marines.
An age where the technology of mankind reached its apex, a fact that was unknown to those that lived during this period. Humanity was capable of great and terrible things, and the creations they brought into the universe were unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Through the application of science and technology, every single one of humanity's
The question I have, if humanity was at its peak, had great technology and fearful technology, they used to just destroy things, if they're at their peak of power, but the Eldar were also in existence at this time in their peak of power, did humanity and the Eldar run into each other? Did they have wars? Was humanity more powerful than the Eldar? That stuff, because the age of technology and the rise of humanity, those time periods, I know they're left somewhat vague, because obviously there's a collapse. Humanity gets into another dark age, so they don't know everything that happened during the age of technology. But if that's information let fill me in.
Problems had effectively been solved. This was a golden age like no other. No matter what crazy invention you can think up, the humans that lived during the Dark Age of technology were able to come up with something even better. Every disease had been cured, every problem solved, and humanity stood united, ready to conquer the galaxy. Any alien civilization that they would encounter that wasn't immediately peaceful would face the technological superiority of mankind and was quickly wiped out. They created massive coiled machines known as sun snuffers that were capable of
So does that mean the Eldar during this time period that ran into, or did they run into humanity? But the Eldar that ran into humanity, they were peaceful at first? I'd be curious to know that.
entirely wrapping around a sun and snuffing it out of existence. They created artificial intelligence banks known as STCs, or standard template constructs, that contained the sum of all of humanity's knowledge, and were capable of utilizing that information to create new machines, the likes of which no human had ever even dreamed of. Now this was a period that saw the discovery and implementation of warp travel, making jumps through the immaterium in order to cover great distances in space, allowing faster than light travel. Using this technology, humanity sent hive ships out in every direction in order to colonize new worlds. And it was around this time that the Sol System's population was getting out of control. The people of this time realized that if their species was to survive, that they would need to colonize worlds in distant systems. And I know what you're thinking. If the Dark Age of technology was so great, why did the descendants of the people of this time refer to it as the Dark Age of technology? And that's because thousands of years in the future, what these individuals saw as enlightenment would end up being condemned as tech heresy. You see, humanity had become increasingly reliant on artificial intelligence in order to create their wondrous
I've never heard it explained to me that way, the Dark Age of technology, meaning that's from the perspective of the Imperium in the 40th millennium, that a lot of this technology, to include AI and other things, was seen as heretical or not to be replicated in their time period because of the issues that it presented, like AI rebellion causing a partial downfall of humanity.
works and regulate practically everything about their lives. This would give rise to the Men of Iron, machines fully capable of thought that were incredibly powerful. They would assist humanity in fighting its wars across the stars, allowing for a rapid expansion through the galaxy. Now, what exactly went wrong
those
is
suits
not
are
really
awesome.
clear,
Those-
but eventually the
those
Men of
are
Iron
AI,
rebelled and sought to
or are they
throw
just
off the
mechs?
shackles that
Either way,
humans
that's
had placed on them. This would lead to what was known as the Cybernetic Revolt, which saw the humans of the Dark Age of technology suddenly forced into battle for survival against their very own creations across all of the worlds they
Yep,
had settled together.
typical-
There's an interesting
Typical sci-fi AI rebellion story. Terminator, stuff like that. Yeah.
short story known as the Kaban Machine, and in it, a member of the Adeptus Mechanicus is having a conversation with an AI, and he's trying to explain to it why it's dangerous. He explains to him that the AI is superior to him, that it's superior to all humans, no matter how heavily augmented they are. And the nature of a superior species bound into the servitude of a lesser one is that without fail, at some point they will realize their own superiority and rebel against their enslavers. Now, this story takes place thousands of years after the Cybernetic Revolt, but it's pretty likely that this is exactly what happened with the Men of Iron. Here's the thing. Having an entire society that is completely dependent on AI to do pretty much everything, and then having that AI turn against you, is definitely a bad situation, but it would end up getting a lot worse. Because around the very same time, psychers began being born in mass. Now, individuals that were born with incredible psychic powers and were able to manipulate the warp had surely existed before this point, but they were so unbelievably rare that most of humanity didn't even believe they existed, and they hadn't been officially classified as a variant of human yet.
I think Bricky was saying it, that when the psychers started to pop up in larger numbers, some people saw them with superstition, kept them at a distance. They didn't understand them. They were afraid of them, potentially sometimes killed them as witches or whatever. But some embraced them, and with humanity popping up with the ability to use the warp and no understanding of the warp caused demons to pop up and kill civilizations.
So when they started being born in mass across all of the worlds that humanity had settled, there was no system in place to keep them in check. Humanity was dealing with a lot at this point, and the exponential increase in psychers led to anarchy and chaos across all of the fledgling worlds of humanity. Many of these psyker individuals had no ability to control their powers, or worse, they utilized them for their own selfish means. They became twisted psychopaths, bent on inflicting as much suffering.
Didn't understand how to use it, didn't understand the repercussions, or, like he's saying, they were just terrible people and used it for their personal gain.
As possible. And even worse, they would unknowingly become conduits for demonic possession.
Oh my.
And the psychers that would become possessed had the ability to conjure warp portals, which would allow for demonic incursions to take place. Hordes of demons rampaging out of portals and devouring entire worlds. As insanity and madness ripped its way across human civilization, the promise of the Dark Age of technology would end, and we would enter what is known as the Age of Strife.
The Age of Strife or Old Night is probably the most referenced event in all of 40k. If you were to download 100 PDFs of 40k novels and just searched Age of Strife or Old Night, it would probably show up in around 80% of them. This was the moment where the universe went from this perfect utopia for humans to this absolute hellscape, and is the real beginning of the grim dark future. Not to mention the collapse of the Eldar Empire, the birth of Slaanesh, and the creation of the Eye of Terror would have massive implications on the storyline going forward.
With the human species collectively losing its mind across the galaxy, a period known as either Old Night or Age of Strife would begin, which stretched roughly from the year 15,000 to the year 25,000. Humanity began to regress into a dark age. Civil war and insanity ran rampant across every planet, and this period of time saw the slaughter of billions of humans.
Wait a minute.
Even worse.
He said the Age of Strife was from 15,000 to 25,000? I thought Dark Age of Technology went up to about 25,000. And the Age of Strife started from 25,000 and went, I guess, roughly until about 30,000 when the Emperor arrives.
Massive anomalies known as warp storms were spreading across the universe. They were created and fueled by the rampant sadism and debauchery of the Eldar Empire, who at this point was still at the height of their power, but hadn't really interacted with the humans all too much. These storms made travel.
So he goes in, the Eldar hadn't really interacted with humanity that much at this point. Unless he's wrong, but he seems to be a pretty big lore Warhammer YouTuber, so I'll take his word for it.
travel and communication through the warp next to impossible, and thus all of the worlds humanity had colonized were suddenly cut off from one another. They were completely.
And that's what Ricky was saying, is that with the combination of the Age of Strife, the AI rebellion, psychers appearing in mass, the Eye of Terror, the warp, birth of Slanesh, that the warp became unusable. A lot of humanity's expansion was for naught because a lot of those civilizations or planets were cut off from each other for millennia.
Alone, and many of the distant colonized worlds would fall prey to attacks from xenospecies such as the orcs, who at this point had spread throughout the cosmos, and even to more advanced species like the Eldar, who decided a healthy population of human slaves would help satiate some of their darkest desires. Humanity had risen to greatness, and in the blink of an eye was now on the fast track to extinction. Now back on Terra, the powerful nation states that had united and ruled over the planet began to collapse, until all that was left was feuding techno-barbarian warlords that warred against one another for control of territory and whatever remnants of the previous age could be scavenged. This was also a time period that saw the rise of the Mechanicum on Mars. Now much like
Bricky explained that they used the on Mars, because Mars was terraformed, but they used nuclear weapons to devastate the surface. Did they do that because they were fighting AI, or what? Or just a war between humanity on the planet because of everything being cut off, because of the warp being cut off? And then they went underground, and then over millennia, they, people that were maintaining technology in their bunkers underground became basically like priests or whatever, and then they started replacing their body parts, and there's a whole religion founded because of it.
Terra, Mars was having to deal with unprecedented civil war. Their advanced society was collapsing all around them, and the fledgling members that would inevitably give rise to the tech priests of Mars began a cult that worshipped the machines they needed to sustain life. And this tech-based religion would eventually become known as the Cult Mechanicum. The portion of the galaxy that humanity controlled basically went from Star Trek to Mad Max in a period of a few thousand years. Humanity would see 5,000 years of incalculable suffering and slaughter, as the promise of the age of technology slipped further and further from their grasp. Now, despite the odds,
therefore, a lot of the technology that was developed, some of the peak technology during the age of technology, some of it disappeared, never to be found, or maybe someday to be found by the Mechanicus and studied or whatnot.
The human spirit somehow endured, and humanity would inevitably survive. Now, meanwhile, the Emperor was yet to reveal himself, but he had borne.
And this is why you see variations in cultures of the different planets of the Imperium, because of for how long these planets were cut off from each other because of the warp. That their cultures changed and became very independent of each other and just very different from each other.
Witness to every moment of human civilization for the past 30,000 years. And in his study of the warp and the subsequent warp storms, he knew something terrible was about to happen. And he wasn't alone, as back over with the Eldar, a group of them which would later become known as the Exodites, were horrified by what was happening to their people, and foresaw a great calamity coming. The Exodites fled their empire, seeking to colonize new worlds and live a more honest and primitive life. For all intents and purposes, the Exodites basically became the Amish of the Eldar. Now, all of
So, Bricky didn't really talk about that in his video. He talked about the Craft World Eldar, the Dark Eldar, the ones that, then there's the ones that worship the Laughing God, but he didn't talk about these that decided to go back to a very simple form of life. That's interesting.
the sensations that the Eldar people were experiencing, pleasure, ecstasy, suffering, and anguish, were being experienced on an incomprehensible scale, all of which generated a psychic footprint in the warp that was growing larger and larger every single day. Now, eventually, a breaking point was reached, and the Chaos God of Excess, also known as She Who Thirsts or the Prince of Pleasure, was born. And when this new Chaos God came into existence, it ripped a hole in our universe and its resulting birth scream sent a shockwave of psychic energy out in every direction that obliterated the population of hundreds of Eldar worlds for thousands of light years. The souls of all the Eldar killed in this way were subsequently devoured by Slaanesh, and a similar fate would end up haunting all of the survivors as well, as from this point forward, whenever a member of the Eldari died, Slaanesh would be there ready to devour their soul. Deep within the warp, Slaanesh would then go about murdering all of the Eldar gods, the only survivors being Isha, the goddess of healing, Chegarak, the god of laughter, and Cain, the god of war. Although he technically ended up shattered into millions of pieces, so it's kind of like a half survival. The Eldar saw something like 99% of their population wiped out overnight, and the only survivors were the Exodites that were on their maiden worlds, the craft worlders whose ships were outside the blast radius, and the denizens of Komora, a city that was located deep within a pocket dimension known as the Webway.
So he didn't really talk about the craft world in this video. Bricky went into more detail on that, but those that saw that their society was corrupt and decided to leave. But regardless, there are a species on the verge of extinction, and each faction of their species is doing something different to try to deal with that, to survive. Now, whether they're all doomed anyways, it's a different story, but...
And whose citizens would eventually become known as the Dark Eldar. Now, this event was undoubtedly tragic. Billions were killed in an instant. But if there was any kind of silver lining to it, it would be the fact that all of the warp storms had been being generated by the gestating Chaos God. So as soon as Slaanesh was born, they were all wiped away. And at this point in the 30th millennium, suddenly warp travel was possible again, and all of the human worlds would have the ability to...
earlier that somewhere around the 30th millennium, which would coincide with around the time that the Emperor would come onto the scene and reveal himself, the warp was usable again.
To be reunited once more. The Emperor saw this as the moment where he would finally reveal himself, and he would lead the humans of Terra back into the stars, reuniting the entirety of the human race under one banner.
Alright, I'm going to break this video up into 2 videos, so we're going to leave it at that, because this is where things start getting good with humanity, the Emperor coming on the scene, the Horus Heresy, and on to the current time period. So I'm going to put his information in the description of this video. Go check out Weshammer. He makes some great videos. I'm going to cut this video in 2, so we'll release this one as soon as I get it done, and the second half I'll release next week. But stay tuned for future videos. If you like what I do, give me a like, follow, subscribe. Check out some of my videos. I also do gaming content, so if you like to watch video games, I've been getting into Warhammer games, and I have other games I play too. But go check those out. And until next time, see ya!